They had an understanding, an unspoken deal, enemies, separated by a few hundred meters of mud, who had silently agreed not to kill each other. No one wrote it down, no general approved it. But in certain trenches of the Western Front, German and Australian soldiers had found something remarkable, a way to survive, together. They wouldn't fire at breakfast, they wouldn't shell the latrines, snipers would aim to miss, and for weeks it worked, until one night in May 1916, without warning, the sky exploded. In minutes, just minutes, 40 Australians were dead, 60 more lay screaming in the mud. The arrangement was over, and the men who paid the price had never even known it existed. What was this secret pact between enemies? Why did commanders on both sides want it destroyed? And what does it reveal about the true nature of war, when soldiers found a way to be human and were punished for it? This is a story they never taught you, a truth buried for over a century, and once you hear it, you will never see the Great War the same way again. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I'm always amazed to see how far the ANZAC story travels, and if you haven't yet, subscribe now, because this channel uncovers the hidden truths of Australia and New Zealand's war history that most documentaries ignore. Now, let's go back to 1916, to a stretch of trenches the Australians called the Nursery, where everything was quiet, too quiet. When Australian soldiers stepped off the trains in northern France in March 1916, they carried with them the weight of Gallipoli. 8 months of blood, heat, flies and death on those barren Turkish cliffs had forged them into something different from the eager volunteers who had left Australian shores. They had seen friends torn apart by shrapnel. They had buried men in graves so shallow that arms sometimes rose through the sand. They had learned what it meant to fight an enemy who would not break, on ground that could not be held. Now they were here, in France, in Flanders, on the Western Front, and they expected more of the same, perhaps worse. The Germans, they had been told, were not like the Turks. Charles Bean, Australia's official war correspondent, would later note that the average Australian soldier quickly recognised that while the individual Turkish soldier had been brave and stubborn, the German, with his extraordinary powers of application and organisation, was an opponent infinitely more formidable. But what the Australians found in those first weeks was not what they expected. Not at all. The sector they were assigned to was called the Nursery, a stretch of waterlogged trenches near the Belgian border, close to the town of Armentières. The name said everything. This was where fresh troops were sent to learn, to acclimatise, to understand the rhythms of trench warfare, before being thrown into the great battles that everyone knew were coming. And the Nursery was quiet, not silent. There was always the distant rumble of artillery somewhere along the line, always the occasional crack of a rifle shot, but quiet in a way that seemed almost unnatural. After Gallipoli, where Turkish snipers had made every movement a gamble with death, the Australians found themselves in trenches where men could walk upright in broad daylight without being shot, where breakfast could be eaten in something approaching peace, where the enemy across no man's land seemed content to leave them alone. Lance Corporal James Belford of the 1st Battalion wrote home on Anzac Day, 1916, describing this strange new world. "It is a lovely day today, and the place where we are now is about 500 to 600 yards from the firing line. There is an orchard, so I guess our boys will make short work of the fruit when it gets a bit ripe. If you were here just now, you wouldn't know there was a war on. Everything is so quiet. If you were here just now, you wouldn't know there was a war on." Belford was not naive. He had survived Gallipoli. He knew what war looked like, what it smelled like, what it sounded like when a man took a bullet through the brain. And yet here he was, writing home about orchards and lovely days, about quiet that seemed to stretch across no man's land like a shared secret. What Belford did not know, what most of the Australians did not know, was that this quiet had a name. British soldiers who had been on the Western Front longer called it live and let live. It was not a truce. It was not a ceasefire. It was something stranger and more fragile, an unspoken understanding between enemies who had decided, somewhere in the mud and misery of the trenches, that they did not always have to kill each other. The live and let live system had developed spontaneously across the Western Front since the early months of the war. In certain sectors, particularly those designated as quiet by the high commands on both sides. Soldiers separated by a few hundred meters of shell-torn earth had arrived at tacit arrangements. They would not fire at certain times. They would not shell certain places. Snipers would aim high. Artillery would land in predictable locations, giving men time to take cover. It was survival, pure and simple. Men who faced each other day after day, week after week, month after month, had discovered that constant aggression benefited no one. If you shot at the enemy during breakfast, the enemy would shoot at you during breakfast. If you shelled their latrines, they would shell yours. But if you left them alone, they would leave you alone. One veteran explained it to a newcomer with brutal simplicity. "Mr. Bosch ain't a bad fellow. You leave him alone, he'll leave you alone." This was the world the Australians had entered, a world where the enemy across no man's land might be more predictable than your own generals, where survival depended on rules that existed in no manual, that were spoken of in whispers, if they were spoken of at all, where humanity had found a way to persist, even amid the industrialized slaughter of modern warfare. The French farms around Armentières seemed almost pastoral compared to the desolation the Australians had left behind in the Dardanelles. There were villages here, damaged, yes, but still standing. There were civilians. There were cafes where a man could buy wine and forget, for an hour, that death waited just a few kilometres away. After the barren rocks of Gallipoli, France seemed like a kind of paradise. But paradise in the trenches was always temporary, and the Australians were about to learn a truth that the veterans of the Western Front already knew. The arrangement could be broken. When it was, the price was paid, not in days or weeks, but in minutes. And the men who paid it were often those who had never even known the arrangement existed. To understand what happened to the men of the 11th Battalion on that terrible night in May, we must first understand the strange and fragile system they had unknowingly entered. A system that had no official name, that appeared in no military manual, that generals on both sides would have denied existed if asked directly. And yet it was real as the bullets that were not fired, as real as the shells that landed in the same empty fields day after day, as real as the lives it saved, and the lives it would cost when it finally broke. The live and let live system operated through rituals, not religious rituals, but something equally sacred to the men in the trenches, rituals of survival. In some sectors, artillery fired at exactly the same time each day, 7 o'clock in the evening perhaps, with the regularity of a church bell. Men on both sides knew to take cover before the shells came. They knew where the shells would land. The same craters, the same stretches of empty trench, the same patches of already ruined ground. The bombardment satisfied the requirements of headquarters for activity while killing no one. It was theatre. Deadly theatre, but theatre nonetheless. Snipers participated in the arrangement too. In quiet sectors, a sniper might fire dozens of rounds in a day without hitting anyone, not because he was a poor shot. German snipers in particular were legendarily accurate, but because he was aiming to miss. A shot that cracked overhead, close enough to be heard, far enough to be survived. Proof of aggression for the officers, proof of restraint for the enemy. Even mealtimes became sacred. Breakfast was often an unofficial ceasefire along stretches of the line. Men on both sides emerged from their dugouts, heated their tea, ate their rations in something approaching peace. No one fired, no one shelled. It was understood. And in that understanding, enemies became something almost like neighbours. Hostile neighbours, yes, but neighbours who had agreed not to burn down each other's houses. British sociologist Tony Ashworth, who spent years studying this phenomenon through soldiers' diaries, letters, and testimonies, documented how elaborate these arrangements could become. In some sectors, white flags were raised to mark the location of latrines, and neither side would shell a man while he was answering nature's call. In others, working parties repaired trenches in full view of the enemy, unmolested, because both sides benefited from strong defences against the rain and mud that were the common enemy of all. The system was not universal. There were always active sectors where killing never stopped, where snipers shot to kill and artillery fell without warning or pattern. But in the quiet sectors, and there were many of them, particularly in 1915 and early 1916, the arrangement held. Men who were supposed to be enemies had found a way to coexist, but the generals could not tolerate it. From the perspective of high command, warm, dry, well-fed men in chateaux, miles behind the lines, the live and let live system was a disease. It sapped the offensive spirit that commanders believed essential to victory. It turned soldiers into something uncomfortably close to pacifists. It suggested that the men doing the fighting had more in common with each other than with the officers ordering them to die. General Douglas Haig, who took command of the British Expeditionary Force in late 1915, was determined to stamp it out. But how do you force men to kill each other when they have silently agreed not to? How do you monitor restraint? How do you punish a sniper for missing when he claims he was aiming true? The answer was the trench raid. Raids were small-scale night attacks, anywhere from 10 to 200 men creeping across no man's land to kill, capture, or destroy. They were ordered by headquarters, monitored by headquarters, and impossible to fake. If a raid was successful, prisoners would be brought back as proof. If it failed, casualties would be proof of the attempt. There was no way to pretend a raid had happened when it had not, and there was no way to cooperate with the enemy in a raid, because you cannot exchange prisoners or dead bodies without someone noticing. The raids served multiple purposes. Officially, they gathered intelligence and maintained pressure on the enemy. But their true effect, perhaps intended, perhaps not, was to destroy the ecosystem of restraint that soldiers had built. After a raid, everything changed. The side that had been raided would retaliate, but no one knew when, where, or how. Trust evaporated. The careful rituals of survival collapsed. Quiet sectors became active sectors overnight, and men who had lived in fragile peace for weeks or months suddenly found themselves targets again. The raiding policy spread like a virus through the Western Front in 1916, and the Australians, newly arrived, eager to prove themselves, were encouraged to participate. They did not yet understand that every raid carried a price, and that the price would often be paid not by the raiders themselves, but by other men, in other trenches, days or weeks later. The 11th Battalion was about to learn this lesson, in the worst possible way. The men of the 11th Battalion were Western Australians, miners from Kalgoorlie and Coolgardie, farmers from the wheat belt, and stockmen from the vast stations of the outback. They had crossed the world to fight for king and empire, and they had already paid in blood. At Gallipoli, they had been among the first to land, among the first to die. They had held the line at Lone Pine while Turkish attacks broke against them like waves against rock. They had endured the evacuation, that strange and silent retreat that felt less like escape than abandonment. Now they were in France, assigned to the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Division, taking their turn in the Nursery sector near Armentières. After Gallipoli, the quietness must have seemed almost miraculous. The trenches here were not dug into the earth but built up from it. Breastworks of sandbags and timber raised above the waterlogged Flanders soil. They were crude compared to the elaborate German fortifications, but they provided shelter, and shelter in the trenches was everything. The 11th Battalion took over their sector in late May 1916. The days passed with the strange rhythm of trench life. Stand to at dawn, breakfast, work parties, rest, stand to at dusk, the long, nervous hours of darkness. There was shelling, yes, there were occasional rifle shots, but nothing like Gallipoli, nothing like the constant terror they had known on those Turkish cliffs. Some of the veterans were suspicious. They had learned at Gallipoli that quiet could be a prelude to catastrophe, that the enemy was most dangerous when he seemed most peaceful, but others allowed themselves to hope. Perhaps this sector really was different. Perhaps they had earned a respite. They had not. What the Australians did not know was that the delicate balance of the Nursery was already collapsing. In the weeks before their arrival, there had been raids, Australian raids on German positions, aggressive patrols meant to demonstrate the offensive spirit that headquarters demanded. The Australians were new to the Western Front, eager to prove that they were as formidable here as they had been at Gallipoli. Their officers encouraged them, their generals expected results, but every raid was a message, and every message demanded a reply. On the night of 29 to 30th of May 1916, the Germans sent their reply. It began without warning. One moment, the night was quiet. The ordinary quiet of the Nursery, broken only by the distant rumble of guns along other parts of the line. The next moment, the sky split open. German artillery, not the desultory shelling the Australians had come to expect, but a concentrated barrage of terrifying intensity, fell on the 11th Battalion's position near La Cordonnerie Farm. The great bombs dug huge craters in the soft agricultural soil, as Charles Bean would later write, and the flimsy breastworks and shelters were flung up into the air in shredded and splintered fragments. The men had no time to react, no time to take cover, no time to understand what was happening. The shells came so fast, so heavy, that the world became nothing but noise and fire and flying earth. And then came the worst of it. A single massive shell, a Minenwerfer bomb, the terrible trench mortar that German soldiers called the Mini, landed directly among a group of Australians. The explosion was catastrophic. In that single moment, approximately 40 men were killed. 60 more were wounded. A photograph taken the next day shows the crater, enormous, obscene, a wound torn into the earth that seemed to mirror the wound torn into the battalion. One of the survivors, a veteran of Gallipoli, a man who had seen death in all its forms, Mbartui, was heard to say afterward, "By cripes, we never had shelling like that on ANZAC." He was right. They never had. At Gallipoli, the Turkish artillery had been limited, their shells often old and unreliable. Here the Germans had guns beyond anything the Australians had faced. Heavy howitzers, Minenwerfers, field guns that could fire with mechanical precision. And they had used them all in a single concentrated burst of violence to deliver a message that could not be misunderstood. The arrangement was over. By dawn, 36 men of the 11th Battalion lay dead, so many, killed so close together, that they would be buried in a single row at Rue-Petillon Military Cemetery. Their graves stand there still, white stones against green grass, a silent testament to a night when fragile peace was shattered and men paid with their lives. The attack had lasted only minutes, but in those minutes, everything changed. The nursery was no longer quiet. The unspoken understanding that had allowed men on both sides to survive had been torn apart by shells and blood and screaming, and the men who paid the price, the miners and farmers and stockmen of Western Australia, had never even known the arrangement existed. They had simply been soldiers, doing their duty, trusting that the quiet meant safety. It had not. It never would again. In the days that followed the attack at Cordonnerie Farm, the survivors of the 11th Battalion tried to make sense of what had happened. They buried their dead, 36 men in a single row, their graves so close together that the headstones nearly touch. They wrote letters home that struggled to explain the inexplicable. They carried on, because soldiers carry on, because there was nothing else to do. But something had changed, not just in the 11th Battalion, but across the entire nursery sector. The quiet that had once seemed like a blessing now felt like a trap. Every silence might be the silence before another barrage. Every peaceful morning might be the last. The men who had begun to trust the arrangement, who had allowed themselves to believe that enemies could coexist, now understood that trust was a luxury they could not afford. By the end of June 1916, over 600 Australians had been killed in the nursery. 600 men, in a sector that was supposed to be quiet. 600 men who had died not in great battles, but in raids and counter-raids, in barrages and retaliations, in the slow grinding collapse of a system that had once kept them alive. The arrangement was dying everywhere along the Western Front. The raiding policy that headquarters had implemented was doing exactly what it was designed to do, destroying the fragile ecosystem of restraint, forcing men back into a posture of constant aggression. Quiet sectors became active sectors became charnel houses, and the great battles of 1916, the Somme, Verdun, were about to make everything that had come before seem like a prelude. On 1st July 1916, the British Army launched its offensive on the Somme. It was supposed to be the breakthrough that would end the war. Instead, it became the bloodiest day in British military history. Nearly 20,000 British soldiers were killed before sunset. 60,000 were casualties by nightfall. The wire had not been cut. The dugouts had not been destroyed. The Germans emerged from their shelters and mowed down wave after wave of advancing infantry with machine guns that never seemed to stop firing. The Australians were not yet on the Somme, but they would be soon, and before they arrived, they would face another disaster, one that would reveal, with terrible clarity, what happened when the last remnants of humanity between enemies were finally extinguished. Fromelles. The name means nothing to most people today. It is not Gallipoli, not the Somme, not Passchendaele, but to the Australians who fought there on the night of 19th of July 1916, it was hell itself. The attack at Fromelles was conceived as a diversion, a feint to prevent the Germans from sending reinforcements to the Somme. The 5th Australian Division, newly arrived in France, was ordered to assault heavily fortified German positions across 4,000 yards of waterlogged ground. Many of the men had been in the country for barely weeks. Some had been in the trenches for only days. The bombardment that preceded the attack warned the Germans exactly what was coming. By the time the Australians went over the top at 6 o'clock in the evening, in broad daylight, with 3.5 hours of summer sun still remaining, the enemy was waiting for them. What followed was slaughter. The air was thick with bullets, one survivor would later recall, swishing in a flat, crisscrossed lattice of death. Hundreds were mown down in the flicker of an eyelid, like great rows of teeth knocked from a comb. In a single night, 5,133 Australians were killed, wounded, or captured. The 60th Battalion, which had entered the battle with 887 men, mustered only one officer and 106 other ranks the next morning. Entire companies had ceased to exist. The ground between the lines was carpeted with Australian dead. And then came the final cruelty. On the morning of 20th of July, as Australian stretcher-bearers struggled to reach the wounded still lying in no man's land, a German officer approached under a white flag. Through Private William Miles, who spoke with him in the devastated ground between the trenches, the Germans proposed a truce, a ceasefire to allow both sides to collect their wounded and bury their dead. A moment of mercy in the midst of catastrophe. Major Alex Murdoch of the 29th Battalion went forward to negotiate. The Germans seemed willing. For a brief moment, it seemed that humanity might prevail, that enemies who had been killing each other hours before might pause, might help each other, might acknowledge that the men screaming in the mud were men, and not merely targets. But the truce was not to be. Major General James Mackay, commanding the 5th Division, ordered it ended. The reasons were never fully explained. Perhaps he feared a trick. Perhaps he believed that any show of weakness would encourage the enemy. Perhaps he simply could not imagine that Germans might act with honor. Whatever his reasons, the order was clear. The truce was over. And for 3 more days and nights, wounded Australians lay in no man's land, dying by inches, while their mates risked their own lives to crawl out and drag them back under enemy fire. Some of the wounded survived by scavenging water from the canteens of the dead. They hid in shell holes by day, pressing themselves into the mud, and crawled toward their own lines by night. Some made it, many did not. The arrangement had been broken at Cordonnery Farm. At Fromelles, even the possibility of mercy was denied. More than 2 years after the Battle of Fromelles, on the morning of 11th November 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The armistice had been signed, the war was over, and Charles Bean, Australia's official war correspondent, walked across the old battlefield where so many of his countrymen had died. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We found the old no man's land simply full of our dead," he wrote. "The skulls and bones and torn uniforms were lying about everywhere. 2 years, 2 years of rain and snow and summer sun, and still the dead lay where they had fallen. No one had buried them. No one had gathered their bones. They had simply been left there in the mud between the trenches while the war ground on, and new men came to die in new battles, and the world forgot that these men had ever existed. Today, 1,199 names are inscribed on the wall at VC Corner Cemetery near Fromelles. Australians who died in that single night of slaughter, and who have no known graves. The unidentified remains of 410 of them lie in mass graves beneath 2 grass plots, their bones mingled together because no one could tell them apart. It is the only solely Australian war cemetery in France. It is the only one without individual headstones. But this documentary has not been about Fromelles. It has been about what came before, about the strange and fragile system that men in the trenches created to survive, and about what happened when that system was destroyed. The men of the 11th Battalion who died at Cordonnery Farm on 30 May 1916 lie in a different cemetery, Rue-Petillon Military Cemetery, a few kilometres away. 36 of them, buried in a single row, their white headstones standing like soldiers at attention. They were not killed in a great battle. Their names do not appear in most history books. They died because an arrangement was broken, an arrangement they may never have known existed. What are we to make of this? Some historians have seen the live and let live system as evidence of fundamental human decency, proof that even in the midst of industrialized slaughter, men could find ways to be merciful to their enemies. Others have seen it as simple pragmatism, a rational response to an irrational situation, a way to survive when survival seemed impossible. Robert Axelrod, a political scientist who studied the phenomenon decades later, saw it as an example of cooperation emerging spontaneously between enemies. He compared it to a game, a deadly game, but a game with rules that both sides understood. If you did not shoot at the enemy during breakfast, the enemy would not shoot at you. If you fired your artillery at predictable times and places, the enemy would do the same. Mutual restraint benefited everyone. Mutual aggression benefited no one. But the destruction of the system tells a darker story. It tells us that cooperation is fragile, that it can be shattered by those who are not part of it, by commanders who never held a rifle in the mud, by generals who dined in chateaux while their men died in ditches, by a war machine that could not tolerate any pause in the killing. The men in the trenches had found a way to be human. The system could not allow it. Perhaps that is the true tragedy of the live and let live arrangement, not that it failed, but that it succeeded for so long against such impossible odds. For months, in some sectors for years, enemies who were supposed to hate each other found ways to coexist. They did not stop being soldiers. They did not desert or mutiny or refuse to fight. But in the spaces between orders, in the quiet hours before dawn, in the moments when no officer was watching, they chose life over death, restraint over aggression, humanity over hatred. And when that humanity was taken from them, when the raids came, when the arrangements collapsed, when quiet sectors became killing grounds, they died. Not because they were cowards, not because they had failed, but because they had dared to believe, even for a moment, that war did not have to mean constant slaughter. The 36 men of the 11th Battalion who lie at Rue-Petillon Cemetery were miners and farmers and stockmen. They had crossed the world to fight for their country. They had survived Gallipoli. They had come to France expecting to face the enemy, and they had found instead a strange and fragile peace. Then the shells came, and in minutes, just minutes, they were gone. They lie there still, 36 white stones in a row, waiting for someone to remember them, waiting for someone to tell their story, waiting for someone to understand what was lost on that night in May 1916 when the arrangement was broken and the price was paid in blood. This is the story we do not tell about the Great War, the story of men who found a way to live, even in hell, and of the forces that would not let them. They were soldiers, they were enemies, and for a brief, impossible moment, they were something else. Something almost like neighbors, something almost like friends. Then the arrangement ended, and they became what the war had always wanted them to be, casualties.